Hey guys, tonight we're taking a stroll back to 19th century Paris, not to admire the Eiffel Tower, which doesn't exist yet, or to sip absinthe with bohemians, but to witness something far more sluggish. Imagine a quiet park, dappled with afternoon light. Children's laughter floats lazily through the trees. A man in a cravat is holding a small wicker basket. He sets it down. The lid creaks open, and out waddles a tortoise. He places a lettuce leaf at the far end of a dirt path, gives a small nod, and backs away. A small crowd leans forward with bated breath. This is not a joke. This is a tortoise race. You're there, tucked into a rickety wooden bench under a maple tree. You can hear the rustle of parasols and the occasional snap of a fan closing. You can even smell the faint tang of horse dung from a nearby boulevard. But let's focus on the tortoises. Because yes, for a brief moment in 19th century Paris, these slow-moving reptiles became the absurd darlings of public entertainment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far we stretch across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's the late 1840s. Paris is sprawling, bustling, puffing itself up with wide boulevards and public gardens, trying to prove to itself and the world that it is the cultural heart of everything. It's a place obsessed with fashion, with ideas, with spectacles. And somehow, into all of this, between the salons and the revolutions, slips a peculiar trend that even by French standards is delightfully unnecessary: competitive tortoise racing. The races often take place in the Jardin des Plantes, a botanical garden meant for scholarly contemplation. But let's be honest, Parisians get bored easily. So they start bringing their pets. Then the pets become spectacles. And before long, people are actually organizing semi-formal tortoise derbies. Imagine this: a dozen tortoises, each one maybe the size of a small casserole dish, lined up in a row. Someone yells, "Aye!" and nothing happens for several minutes. That's the point. It's not about speed. It's about tension. Will your tortoise take a nap? Will it get distracted by a fallen leaf? Will it wander in the completely wrong direction for 20 minutes, only to slowly arc back toward the finish line like a moss-covered comet? It's edge-of-your-seat slowness. Most of the spectators aren't watching for the thrill. They're watching because it's hilarious, because it's absurd, because life is fast and chaotic and filled with deadlines, and tortoises, they just don't care. They move when they want. They stop when they feel like it. And for Parisians stuck in a world of steam engines and social etiquette, that's oddly comforting. You, sitting there on the gravel path with your folded newspaper and a lukewarm café au lait, are part of this sleepy ritual. Someone offers you a bet. 2 centimes on Clementine, the tortoise with the cracked shell who always wanders left. You shrug. Why not? Historians still argue whether this trend began as a parody of horse racing or as a spontaneous outburst of collective boredom. Either way, it sticks. Newspaper clippings from the era mention the races in passing, often buried between a weather report and some letter to the editor about how immoral the youth have become. No one takes it seriously, and yet everyone keeps showing up. The tortoises themselves, surprisingly chill about all of this. Many are kept as household pets, which is more common than you'd think in 19th century Paris. People kept them in tiny courtyard gardens, fed them leftover vegetables, and sometimes even gave them names like Louis, Beatrice, or Petit Chou. Some tortoises were known to be racers, and there are whispered rumors, passed in part gossip, that one particular tortoise, Victor Hugo, no relation to the author, once won 3 races in a row. Triple Crown material. The racetrack is often a stretch of dirt or lawn marked with little sticks and colored bits of cloth. No one quite agrees on the rules. Is the winner the first to reach a lettuce leaf? Or is it the one that goes farthest in 30 minutes? Sometimes it's just whichever tortoise seems to try the hardest, which is entirely subjective, of course. And then there are the sabotages. Mild, of course. A bit of cucumber juice, accidentally spilled to the side, a puff of perfume to distract. These aren't Olympic events. They're more like extremely sleepy performances, each one part joke, part ritual, part community theater. One memorable anecdote, probably fictional, but delightful nonetheless, tells of a tortoise named Napoleon who refused to race unless he had a sprig of thyme tucked under his shell. The owner insisted it focused him. When the thyme was missing, Napoleon would reportedly spin in circles, not fast, mind you, just very, very determinedly. These kinds of details, true or not, are what make the phenomenon so charming. No one cared if the stories were accurate. They were soothing, reassuring. In a city, often anxious with change and unrest, watching a group of reptiles slowly amble toward a leaf was a kind of group meditation. There's even evidence that small wagers were made, though nothing scandalous. Pennies. The real stakes were social. Whose tortoise would get applause? Who would be teased for having the sleepy one? Who brought the cutest ribbon for their racer's shell? You lean back in your bench and watch the tortoises shuffle forward. Someone behind you whispers, "Go, Josephine, go." You smile. Josephine takes another step, and then she stops. For a good 7 minutes. Everyone waits. And isn't that the lesson? Sometimes, the most engaging entertainment is the one that forces you to do nothing, to wait, to watch, to breathe. The thing you begin to notice as you sit on your bench and blink slowly at the tiny parade of armored reptiles before you is that boredom in 19th century Paris wasn't necessarily a problem. It was practically a fashion. While today's world screams with speed and novelty, the Paris of this era has the luxury of slowing down. And so do you. By the 1840s, industrialization has started to hum through the city's veins. Railways are snaking out toward the countryside. Street lighting is being modernized. Everything is speeding up, except the people. At least those who can afford to be leisurely. The bourgeoisie are growing in number and in appetite for amusements, oddities, distractions that are just strange enough to be memorable. This is how tortoise racing quietly slinks onto the cultural menu. It's not advertised. It's not grand. It's just a thing that happens when people find themselves with idle hours and a need to laugh at something harmless. You wouldn't call it a movement, exactly. It's more of a sleepy ripple. But in a way, it tells you a lot about the mood of the time. You see, Paris in the mid-19th century is recovering from political upheaval and reinventing itself as a city of beauty and curiosity. The intellectual salons, the puppet shows, the new cafes, they all buzz with a kind of determined calm, as if everyone is trying to out-sophisticate each other while pretending not to care. And yet, here you are, watching adults in corsets and cravats crouch beside tortoises and cheer them on with wild abandon. There's something deliciously absurd about it. And absolutely no one seems embarrassed. Some accounts describe how these events would follow a gentle picnic. Friends would bring their tortoises wrapped in cloth, carried like noble infants, and unroll them onto the grass like little tanks ready for battle. The racers would then be lined up behind handkerchiefs, often with names pinned delicately to their shells. Eglantine, Marcel, Tiny Tyrant. A self-proclaimed referee, usually just the loudest person present, would declare the race open. There were cheers, there were sighs, and there was almost always a long pause where nothing happened. That was part of the charm. Tortoise racing wasn't about action. It was about commitment. You had to be present, patient, slightly ridiculous. Historians still argue whether these gatherings had any roots in older traditions. Some point to rural snail races in the French countryside, where children would place snails in chalk circles and crown them champions. Others suggest it was an outgrowth of the popular Parisian love for miniature pets, lapdogs, songbirds, turtles, that were easier to care for in tight urban apartments. Either way, the tortoise found its moment. But don't assume these were high society galas. On the contrary, they often straddled the line between genteel nonsense and boisterous mischief. A clerk might come on his day off, still in his work waistcoat, while a local seamstress cheered from the sidelines. Someone's aunt would bring wine. Someone's child would weep inconsolably when their tortoise, Henrietta, wandered backward into a bush and refused to come out. And yet, no one was particularly bothered. That was the point. It was an exercise in detachment. If your tortoise won, you grinned. If it lost, you sipped your lemonade and blamed it on the humidity. Because clearly, tortoises are sensitive to that sort of thing. There are even whispered tales of professional racers, men who owned 3 or 4 tortoises and entered them under different names to hedge their bets. One such man, a Monsieur Dubois, was rumored to have trained his tortoises to follow the scent of strawberries. But when pressed for a demonstration, all 4 of his racers promptly fell asleep in a sunbeam. Fame is fleeting. You glance around your imaginary park scene, and the crowd is a pleasant jumble. No shouts, no horns, no urgency. Just the occasional burst of laughter when a tortoise takes a sharp turn or accidentally rolls over a small pebble with great determination. You notice that many participants carry parasols, not to block the sun, but to shade their tortoises. Because burnt shells are unbecoming, someone mutters behind you, half mocking and half serious. One woman has a picnic basket filled not with food, but with sprigs of parsley and chopped carrots. Race fuel, clearly. A boy, with oversized suspenders, is whispering encouragement to his racer like a miniature sports coach. And while you sit and take it all in, you begin to understand. This isn't about tortoises at all. It's about watching something happen so slowly, so gently, that you have no choice but to slow down with it. It's communal stillness. The newspapers, of course, don't quite know what to make of the whole thing. Satirical journals poke fun at it with cartoons of tortoises smoking pipes or demanding union wages. One suggests replacing the national flag with a shell. Another proposes tortoise jousting. Though whether this was ever attempted is blessedly unknown. Mainstream publications mostly ignore it, though a handful of anecdotes survive in letters and memoirs. A retired school teacher recalls seeing A crowd of perfectly sober adults gathered in absurd reverence around a creature who could not have outrun a sugar cube. He seemed charmed, not annoyed. And some writers, those ever-watchful chroniclers of Parisian life, hint that the tortoise races were a kind of rebellion. A rebellion against haste, against seriousness, against the notion that everything must serve a purpose. What could be more subversive, they mused, than finding joy in the plodding path of a reptile? Even the city police, at this point, are uninterested. They patrol the parks, nod to the gathered crowds, and move on. As long as there's no shouting, no gambling beyond a few sous, and no one trying to tie rockets to their tortoise. Yes, someone once tried. It's all just innocent nonsense. You lean forward slightly, watching one particularly motivated tortoise, Jeanne d'Arc, nudge her way past a sun-drenched pebble. Her shell gleams faintly in the light. A woman nearby fans herself and offers an encouraging, "Très bien, ma belle." Jeanne does not react. She continues, at the exact same speed. Someone offers you a biscuit. You accept. It's lemony, crumbly, perfect. The race will go on for another hour, but no one minds. That's how Paris does boredom. Richly, stylishly, and ever so slowly. By now, you're starting to see a pattern. Well, maybe not in the tortoises' movements, because they haven't exactly moved in patterns, but in the human behavior. You, reclining under your tree with biscuit crumbs on your shirt, are part of a collective effort to be amused by the unamusing. And somehow, it works. Because what Parisians are embracing isn't just absurdity. It's a kind of refined silliness, a refined, intentionally slow silliness. And it's not limited to tortoises. Before this particular craze took off, the city had already begun to flirt with a similar pastime. Snail races. Yes, snails. Even slower, even squishier, and somehow just as competitive. These mini races started, according to scattered anecdotes, in the flower markets and cafe backstreets. Market boys would line up their garden snails on the edge of crates and see which one slid across a cabbage leaf first. The appeal was simple. It was free, it was ridiculous, and no one really had to do anything. Eventually, as with most things in Paris, the idea got fancier. Somewhere between the pleated skirts and pressed trousers, snails turned into novelty pets. Gentlemen who once showed off their watch fobs now carried a favorite snail in a pocket-sized glass dome. One wealthy widow reportedly had an entire greenhouse corner devoted to pampered mollusks, each named after an opera character. Historians still argue whether the tortoise racing evolved directly from the snail fad or was just the next logical step. After all, once you've bet 5 centimes on a snail named Pepe le Gluon, how much farther is it to cheering on a tortoise named King Louis the Slow? Tortoises, however, had certain advantages. For one, they were easier to decorate. You couldn't tie a ribbon to a snail. It would slide right off. Tortoises, with their sturdy shells, became the perfect blank canvas for creative owners. They also lived longer, and thus earned reputations. Snails rarely gained local fame, but tortoises? Well, some of them became legends. There's an apocryphal tale about a race held in the Parc Monceau, where a former cavalry officer arrived with a tortoise painted in bright military stripes and a tiny paper shako glued to its shell. The creature's name? General Escargot, of course. The officer saluted it solemnly before the race began. General Escargot, perhaps sensing the pressure, moved exactly 2 inches and stopped. A child offered it a grape. It declined. These slow races started as a gag, but slowly became something else. shared rituals. An excuse to gather, giggle, and take the pulse of a city by not doing very much at all. And while Paris embraced the tortoise trend in gardens and quiet courtyards, its cafes and boulevards started to reflect the mood. Cartoons in shop windows showed tortoises winning marathons. Cake shops began selling gâteaux tortues, little shell-shaped pastries dusted with powdered sugar. A tobacconist near the Marais even started selling hand-carved, tortoise-shaped snuff boxes. The slow was fashionable. You glance around again at the imaginary garden where today's race is unfolding. The crowd hasn't thinned, it's grown. Two students with unruly hair argue about which breed of tortoise is the most aerodynamic, which is a hilarious debate given the speeds involved. A balding man with pince-nez reads from a folded pamphlet of tortoise tips, most of which involve feeding schedules and shell massages. A woman in violet whispers that she's certain her tortoise Clovis responds to piano music, and maybe he does. Or maybe she just wants him to. That's the real delight here. Belief. You believe in your tortoise. You believe in the moment. You believe that the half-inch progress made by your tiny lumbering companion is meaningful. There's something oddly modern about this, isn't there? In a world where everyone was already worried about modernization, steam, telegraphs, the collapse of traditions, the tortoise was a form of protest. An elegant, unbothered rebuttal to the idea that life must always be rushing forward. One social critic of the time, in a half-joking essay, claimed tortoise racing was the only honest sport left in Paris. Why? Because it refused spectacle. There were no heroes, no danger, no glory. Just patience, gravity, and the vague hope that your tortoise would choose to move today. And yet, there were favorites, repeat winners, talk of breeding. A Madame Lacroix, known to frequent the races in a wide straw hat and a faintly disapproving smile, claimed her tortoise Armand had a winning spirit. Armand was, by all accounts, exactly like every other tortoise. But somehow, the illusion of specialness persisted. This wasn't just projection. It was community building. You begin to realize that in cheering for a tortoise, people were finding ways to cheer for each other, to share a harmless obsession, to believe in the small. As the race progresses, someone strikes up a tune on a concertina. Not fast, more of a slow, looping waltz that fits the vibe perfectly. The child dances with exaggerated slowness beside her father, mimicking the racers. People chuckle, but no one hurries her. In this moment, slowness is contagious. That's when you realize the tortoise race is less a competition and more a meditation. No one's even sure who's winning anymore. Someone suggests they all win. Someone else agrees. A third voice, slightly tipsy on rosé, proposes that they crown the one who stayed most in the moment. A philosophical debate breaks out, quietly, of course. The crowd, lulled into philosophical mush by sunlight and low-stakes reptile motion, begins asking the big questions. What is success? What is movement? Is standing still a choice? You lean back again, arms crossed behind your head, and smile. Because in Paris, even the slowest sport can become a poetic statement. If you've been paying attention, and at this speed, how could you not? You may have noticed that some of these tortoises seem more familiar than others. There's one with a slightly chipped shell and a pink ribbon tied around the middle. Another with an odd zigzag scratch that somehow looks intentional. These aren't just random garden reptiles. These are recurring personalities. And tonight, you finally get to meet the celebrity tortoises of Paris. Yes, you heard that right. Some of these creatures have reputations. They're not etched into stone or taught in history classes, but in the memory of sleepy Parisians who gathered weekend after weekend to watch them shuffle, these tortoises were practically stars. Take, for example, Beauregard, the so-called aristocrat of the Arène. Legend has it that he was once found inside a shoebox behind a perfumery and was adopted by a retired opera singer who swore Beauregard moved only when sung to. His racing shell was lacquered to a soft sheen and often dusted with rose powder. He had a following of elderly women who called themselves les escargots. Don't ask. They'd arrive at every race with pastries and parasols, squealing every time he inched forward. One woman claimed he winked at her. Historians still argue whether tortoises can, in fact, wink. Then there's Camille, a scrappy little tortoise with a wonky back foot and a fierce fan base. Her owner, a milliner named Jeanette, claimed Camille had been raised entirely on radish greens and Beethoven sonatas. Camille didn't win often, but when she did, she celebrated by sleeping in a velvet pouch for 3 days straight. That became her signature. Children would draw tiny victory banners and pin them to their coats when she was expected to race. Jacques Le Petit, on the other hand, was a bit of a diva. A sleek Mediterranean tortoise with a curious red mark on his shell, Jacques was known for sudden bursts of surprising speed, which led some to suspect he had a secret caffeine stash. His owner, Etienne, claimed it was simply discipline and moral superiority. Naturally, rumors once circulated that Jacques had briefly retired after a dramatic tumble off the race line when startled by a rogue butterfly. And then, Madame Pompon? Ah, yes, the Grande Dame. Larger than the others, slower than the others, and somehow more magnetic. Her shell was painted each week with delicate flowers. Her fans insisted she was once owned by a duchess, although no one could verify this. Madame Pompon never finished a race in first place, but she often earned the most applause. It was the way she moved, deliberate, regal, like she was aware that everyone was watching. She was the tortoise equivalent of an opera encore. You sit there now, chewing on another biscuit, this one almond, and realize you're not just watching animals. You're watching stories in motion. These tortoises have mythology. They have arcs. They've inspired sketches in newspapers, bedtime tales, even a lullaby or two. Go, little shell, go! A mother hums nearby as her toddler claps softly to the rhythm of the race. The fascination with these individual tortoises even extends beyond the parks. Some apothecaries report increased demand for tortoise oil, though what it actually was, no one really knows. Probably just olive oil with a fancy label. Children draw tortoises in the margins of their school books, giving them monocles and walking sticks. A small marionette theater near Montmartre even features a play called La Révolte des Tortues, where puppet tortoises rise up against their cruel pigeon overlords. It runs for 3 weeks. Standing ovations every night. What makes these little racers so captivating isn't their speed, obviously, but their personality, or rather, the personality people assign to them. There's a joy in anthropomorphizing slowness, in believing that your tortoise is a philosopher, or a hero, or a misunderstood genius. And perhaps it's true. Perhaps Beauregard does ponder the nature of time as he glides imperceptibly toward a lettuce leaf. Perhaps Jacques Le Petit is chasing destiny, 1 inch at a time. There's a kind of reverence in the air as you observe these celebrities at work. An unspoken understanding that they've become more than pets. They're mascots, mirrors, little domed metaphors for the people who watch them. Slow, steady, delightfully weird. You begin to recognize the subtle way the crowd reacts to each racer. A soft coo for Camille. A ripple of anticipation when Jacques is lifted from his velvet box. A murmur of respectful silence when Madame Pompon takes her first delicate step, as though she's gracing the Louvre with her presence. And somehow, no one laughs too hard. It's all gently amused, never cruel. No jeers, just admiration. Because here, in the warm Parisian afternoon, amid the scent of grass and the rustle of taffeta skirts, the tortoise reigns. One young girl beside you, no more than 8 years old, pulls her tortoise from a picnic basket with great ceremony. She's named him Napoleon, 3.5. He wears a miniature paper crown and appears utterly unbothered by the attention. She lines him up with the others and whispers something into his tiny, indifferent ear. Then she turns to you and says, very seriously, he only races on Tuesdays. You nod. Naturally. This blend of truth and fantasy is the heartbeat of tortoise racing. It isn't about facts, it's about belief, about letting go of the rush and embracing the fiction that slowness is a virtue, a talent, even a calling. You look out across the raceway. The sun has shifted, casting longer shadows across the gravel. Beauregard has stopped entirely and seems to be contemplating a blade of grass. Camille is slowly overtaking Jacques, who has veered left for reasons known only to Jacques. Madame Pompon is still at the starting line, but someone offers her a rose petal, and she seems pleased. You, meanwhile, feel oddly proud. Of them, of yourself, of this whole ludicrous and lovely affair, because in this slow-motion world of high drama and no stakes, everyone wins eventually. The tortoises, of course, weren't the only ones dressed for the occasion. If you thought Parisian fashion was elaborate at the opera, wait until you see what Parisians did when they had to dress a tortoise. That's right. Tortoise fashion was a thing. And no, you're not dreaming. It started simply. A ribbon here, a dab of paint there, a dot of perfume on the shell, maybe, if you were feeling extra fancy. But as the races became more of a weekly ritual, and people began assigning personalities to their racers, the fashion escalated. In true Parisian style, what began as a lark turned into full-blown couture. For reptiles, your first clue is the vendor near the raceway gate, selling miniature accessories from a folding table draped in velvet. There are lace collars, tiny silk sashes, even shell decals shaped like stars, flowers, and fleur-de-lis. One gentleman picks up a monocle-sized circle of glass and asks the vendor, "Do you think Aristide would like this?" No one finds this odd. Historians still argue whether this accessorizing began as a parody of aristocratic dog shows or was born from the sheer boredom of idle hands with embroidery needles. Some say it all started with one eccentric duchess who refused to bring her tortoise into public naked. Whether or not that's true, it's clear that the fashion bug caught on. Tortoises with bows, with bells, with hand-stitched capes. It becomes a kind of gentle arms race. People one-up each other, not with speed, but with flair. One tortoise is seen wearing a tri-corner hat made of papier-mâché and gold thread. Another sports a tiny cape emblazoned with the family crest of the owner, probably borrowed from their actual coat of arms. And then there's the engraving trend. A jeweler in the Marais begins offering light shell etching. Names, initials, or dainty floral designs scratched into the top layer of the tortoise's shell. With the utmost care, of course. Animal welfare wasn't exactly codified at the time, but still, many thought this a bit excessive. The practice, thankfully, doesn't last long, mostly because the tortoises didn't seem to care either way. One particularly stylish racer, Claude, was known for having a collection of 6 hats, one for each day of the week except Sunday, which was his rest day. His owner, a dressmaker named Léonie, insisted each hat matched her own bonnet so they could race as a unit. Claude never moved very quickly, but with a velvet top hat and tiny silver pin, who could blame him? The shell ribbon fad becomes its own subculture. Entire pamphlets circulate on the proper way to tie bows that flatter a tortoise's curvature. A short-lived magazine, Le Reptile Élégant, publishes sketches of shellwear for the discerning flaneur. There's even a satirical song performed at cafes titled Ode to a Well-Dressed Tortoise, complete with accordion accompaniment. You watch now as a proud owner carefully dusts pollen off her tortoise's bonnet. Another ties a red sash around a particularly sleepy reptile, muttering encouragements in Italian. They may be reptiles, but they're styled like royalty. Of course, this fashion wasn't all just whimsy. It had a social function. The accessories became identifiers. Spectators began recognizing tortoises by their gear. The one with the polka dot shell cap, the one with the lavender scarf, the one with the tiny brass bell that tinkled with every hesitant step. And with recognition came cheering. A tortoise didn't have to be fast. It just had to be memorable. You hear names shouted with affection, soft applause for particularly fashionable racers, and the occasional dramatic sigh when a very well-dressed tortoise refuses to move entirely. He's contemplating, someone offers. Philosophical pause. This devotion spills into the homes of their owners. Fashionable tortoise beds, little velvet-lined boxes, begin to appear in boutique windows. A seamstress named Margot is rumored to have designed a wedding veil for 2 tortoises who showed romantic compatibility. Was there a ceremony? Naturally. Held in a public garden and attended by a dozen humans and 0 other tortoises, you can't help but smile at the absurd gentleness of it all. No one's doing this for profit. There are no sponsors, no betting syndicates, no breeding scandals. Just people with time on their hands and a desire to make something slow into something magical. A man beside you, holding a tortoise in a crocheted sling, turns and says, "This is Emile. He's wearing his Tuesday feathers." You nod solemnly. Of course he is. It's Tuesday. Still, some traditionalists push back. Tortoises are noble creatures, one man grumbles in a letter to the editor. They require dignity, not decoration. Others argue that the accessories encourage anthropomorphism, making animals into people, which, depending on your philosophy, is either delightful or dangerous. One pamphlet in particular, titled "The Shell is Enough," circulates among the grumpier intellectual cafes. It argues that shell decoration distracts from the authentic pace of the tortoise soul. You read it. It's a bit much. But even critics can't stop the parade. The tortoise fashion scene continues, soft and slow, and thoroughly enchanting. By now, even the most skeptical observers have to admit, watching a turtle in a tiny cape confidently amble toward a piece of endive is one of the gentlest forms of joy Paris has ever known. You breathe deeply. The crowd murmurs gently, like waves. The leaves sway. And Madame Pompon, now wearing a floral shawl that matches her owner's, blinks once, or maybe not. Hard to tell. She takes a step. Someone near you gasps. A cheer breaks out. It's not for speed. It's for style. It's not just the tortoises that draw a crowd. Take a step back from the race line. Yes, even further, just behind the rose bushes, and you'll see a whole second spectacle unfolding. The spectators. Bonnets, boaters, parasols, top hats tilted just so. The people watching these races are every bit as entertaining as the reptiles crawling across the gravel. The crowd is a patchwork of Parisian life. Wealthy ladies in layers of crinoline fidget with lace gloves while holding parasols to block a sun that doesn't seem all that aggressive. Beside them, a cluster of market boys argue over whose tortoise has the eyes of a champion. An elderly man with 2 canes and a furled newspaper keeps detailed notes in a leather ledger. No one knows what he's tracking, but he's never missed a race. There are young couples, clearly on first or second dates, whispering flirtatiously as they place mock bets. Some bring picnics, some bring wine. A few bring entire picnic tables, though most just unroll gingham cloths directly onto the lawn and unpack jars of jam, bread, hard cheese, and stories. Children weave through the legs of their elders, some clutching string-tied tortoises like birthday gifts, others just watching wide-eyed as their elders cheer and clap. The races become an intergenerational affair. Grandparents claim to have seen the great Gaston win in '46. Their grandchildren listen, half distracted by a racing tortoise wearing what looks suspiciously like a bow tie. And then there are the bettors. Historians still argue how formal these wagers ever got. Some sources insist the races remained purely for fun, while others point to scattered accounts of whispered stakes. A coin here, a jar of preserves there, a favor owed, a bottle of wine, wagered over whether Clementine would pass the shady spot this time. One particularly delightful incident, documented in a Parisian tabloid of the time, involved 2 gentlemen who bet on the outcome of a tortoise race using their wigs as collateral. The loser, bald and dramatically regretful, was said to have shouted, "She had no motivation. I fed her only the best fennel," before storming off to buy a replacement toupee. Naturally, the crowd was sympathetic to the tortoise. You look around now and notice that the spectators have developed rituals of their own. Certain benches are claimed early. Favorite spots near the starting line are accidentally reserved with embroidered cushions. Regulars greet each other like old friends. Back to see Camille lose again, eh? Someone chuckles, nudging a friend who has shown up faithfully every Thursday with the same sullen tortoise. A tiny brass bell is rung before each race, not because it signals anything, but because someone decided it should, and now it's tradition. The bell ringer? An elderly woman named Madame Tortoise, who hasn't missed a race since 1849. She wears a hat shaped like a daisy and claims to be a former ballerina. Is it true? Maybe. No one asks. The crowd also maintains a kind of slow-motion etiquette. No yelling, no stomping, certainly no running. The energy is always soft. Low ripples of laughter, gentle applause, polite cries of encouragement like, "Allez, mon petit chou," and "Regardez, he's thinking about it." You can hear the rustle of programs, though they're not official. People make their own. Small folded papers with the names of the racers scribbled in pencil, sometimes accompanied by illustrations. Someone has drawn a tortoise in a Napoleon hat. Another paper simply reads, "Team Pompon, always." Loyalty runs deep. Vendors weave through the crowd with baskets of roasted chestnuts, lemonade, and thin slices of candied fruit. One man sells tiny watercolor portraits of tortoises in motion, which is to say, portraits of tortoises that look very much like they're not moving at all. Still, business is steady. The air smells like grass and pastry. A distant piano tinkles from an apartment window nearby. Occasionally, a horse-drawn carriage rattles by on the far boulevard, but otherwise, the park feels enclosed, sheltered in its own sleepy bubble where time stretches and the stakes stay gloriously low. One pair of young artists sketch the crowd rather than the tortoises. They whisper commentary to each other. That man's beard is more animated than his pet. Her tortoise has more accessories than her child. Is that one holding a tiny parasol for its tortoise or for herself? The answer is yes. The mood is one of deep, gentle silliness. A man in an apron loudly proclaims his tortoise has aristocratic lineage, while a schoolteacher in glasses corrects him. Tortoises don't have lineages, only habitats. The man shrugs. Then she's descended from a very noble habitat. You find yourself chuckling. Not loudly, just a low chest laugh that doesn't ripple the quiet joy of the event. Because none of this is meant to be serious. That's the point. It's pageantry, parody, and community all wrapped into one slowly unfolding afternoon. You begin to recognize the pattern, the slow build-up, the carefully choreographed beginning, the rising enthusiasm as one tortoise dares to move slightly to the left, the dramatic gasp when another pauses with its nose nearly touching the finish line. But it's not always about who wins. In fact, many spectators prefer the tortoises that refuse to race at all. One such legend, Jean-Paul, famously spent every race curled under a shady bench, unbothered by the chaos. His fans dubbed him the philosopher, claiming he was simply contemplating the meaning of racing. They brought him grapes. Another tortoise. Edith never raced, but wore an ornate beaded collar and was carried from event to event like a minor royal. She had her own velvet cushion and a fan club composed entirely of pastry chefs. No one remembers why. But she was beloved. It's impossible not to be charmed by the humanity of it all. Because in watching these races, people are really watching each other. How they cheer, how they hope, how they laugh gently when the tortoise they championed pauses to sniff a daisy for 5 full minutes. And so you sit, cocooned in soft noise, soft light, soft ground beneath your shoes. Around you, Paris has slowed. Here, boredom has become an art form. You tilt your head, let your shoulders drop, and breathe in deeply. Another tortoise moves forward. A murmur ripples through the crowd like wind through leaves. You smile. No one is in a hurry. That's the magic. But for every dreamy afternoon of quiet clapping and ribboned tortoises, there exists a shadowy figure, ever present, ever frowning, armed with a rake or a broom, and a clipboard stained with ink and frustration. Yes, tonight we meet the unsung, underpaid, and thoroughly unamused heroes of our story. The garden keepers. You spot them early, before the crowd gathers. They're there with their watering cans and leather gloves, trimming hedges, muttering to themselves, occasionally pausing to glare suspiciously at a flower bed. Their job is to maintain order, preserve beauty, and above all, keep the public gardens respectable. And now they have to contend with tortoise derbies. It's not the tortoises that bother them, really. It's the people. the crowds, the breadcrumbs, the champagne corks buried in tulips, the children who think the gravel paths are racetracks for themselves as well, the mothers who let toddlers tug on hedges like they're decorative tassels, and worst of all, the racetracks. Madam, one keeper sighs at a well-dressed woman setting up tortoise hurdles made of toothpicks and thread. This is not an agricultural exhibition. She nods politely and continues, placing a small felt flag into the turf. The keeper mutters something about the city going to the turtles and moves along. Historians still argue whether any official decree was ever issued banning tortoise races from certain parks. Some records suggest the Bas Jardin du Luxembourg posted a brief "No Animal Contest" sign in 1852, while others claim it was merely a rumor spread by the more cantankerous gardeners who couldn't stand to see a cabbage leaf tucked near a marigold. You watch as one such gardener, Monsieur Remy, patrols with the intensity of a man twice his size. He stops beside a boy kneeling in the grass beside his racer. "Victor." The boy whispers encouragements, and Remy leans down, sniffs the air, and frowns. "Is that vinaigrette?" The boy shrugs. "He likes salad." Remy storms off. The gardeners are not heartless villains. They're just exasperated. They've spent weeks coaxing a rose bush into bloom, only to have it trampled by an excited pastry chef lunging forward to retrieve a distracted tortoise. They've tried to maintain peace only to discover someone has set up a hand-painted sign that reads, "Snail Division Finals, 3 p.m. sharp." The worst offenses, by far, involve lettuce, leftover leaves, wilted greens, tortoises abandoning their mid-race snacks in favor of shade. And then the pigeons come, and the ants. One gardener, nearly in tears, once claimed he'd found a pickle, a teaspoon, and a live frog in the same patch of grass after a particularly wild Sunday race. You imagine their break room, a dingy shed behind the greenhouses, where they sip cold coffee and grumble about those shell-walking circus beasts and their noble families. One of them probably has a running list titled "Crimes Committed by Tortoises," which includes disrupting the daffodils and audible flatulence. No one can confirm the latter. Still, there are moments, rare and fleeting, when even the grumpiest gardener softens. A tiny tortoise named Margot inches toward a pile of clover, and Monsieur Remy pauses, just for a second, and mutters, "At least she's eating the weeds." Progress. Some garden keepers try to co-opt the trend. One ambitious fellow named Alphonse attempts to impose rules, official start times, race permits, a strict ban on glitter. He sets up a tortoise inspection station, which is promptly ignored. He retires in defeat after 2 weeks, declaring the public unfit for reptilian culture. Others simply learn to adapt. They schedule their weeding duties around race hours. They sweep extra leaves into tortoise lanes so no one walks on the flower beds. One plants a small clover patch as a peace offering. The tortoises love it. The people cheer. The pigeons, unfortunately, still invade. It's not uncommon to see a gardener standing off to the side, arms crossed, feigning disinterest, only to peek every few minutes and shake their head when Pompon drifts an inch closer to victory. You suspect they secretly have favorites too. And why not? Even the most orderly soul can appreciate the spectacle of a tortoise in a top hat trudging slowly past a bed of daffodils trailed by a shoeless child chanting, "Go, go, go." You, sitting once again on your faithful bench, overhear a pair of gardeners comparing notes. "That one," says the younger, pointing to a particularly large tortoise with gold leaf on its shell. "Ate my begonia." The older one replies, "He's got good taste." The city council, of course, gets involved briefly. There's talk of regulating non-standard animal gatherings, which lasts about as long as a tortoise nap. No one can quite agree on what constitutes a race. Are they timed? Is there a finish line? Must the tortoise move? One official proposes urban reptile etiquette guidelines. It becomes a running joke in the parks. Children begin pretending their tortoises are reading the guidelines aloud. Article 1. Always chew your clover with dignity. In the end, the keepers don't win, but they don't lose either. Like everyone in this peculiar microcosm, they find their rhythm. They grumble, they sweep, they replant what was nibbled, and they watch. Always pretending not to, but watching just the same. One evening, as the sun dips low and the crowd begins to thin, you catch a glimpse of a gardener kneeling beside a tortoise, quietly feeding it a violet petal. No audience, no applause. Just a quiet moment of peace between two very slow-moving entities trying to navigate a city that never quite understood how to stand still. And that, you realize, is the spirit of the whole thing. Now, if everything we've seen so far has felt like a soft blur of parasols, powdered tortoises, and daisy hats, then brace yourself, because even in a world as gentle as 19th century tortoise racing, a scandal was inevitable. And oh, what a scandal it was. It started on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday in late May, 1851. The air smelled faintly of baked pears, and the garden hedges had just been trimmed into immaculate symmetry. The crowd was modest. The tortoises were unusually lively. A group of bakers, off for the day, had brought wine and clapped rhythmically during the races. There was even an accordionist, which lent an almost cinematic glow to the event, if movies had been invented. Then came the race that changed everything. The racers were familiar. Beauregard, ever majestic. Camille, slightly limping. Madame Pompon, of course, decked out in embroidered tulle. But all eyes were on a relative newcomer, a sleek little tortoise named Frederick, wearing a royal blue ribbon and trailing the scent of lemon balm. Frederick was different. He didn't hesitate. He didn't meander. He didn't pause to smell the clover or consider the breeze. He walked. No, he charged. For a tortoise, at least. 3 straight races, 3 straight wins. In the final heat, he crossed the finish line, marked by a biscuit and a spoonful of mashed peas, in under 4 minutes. Unheard of. The crowd gasped. One man fainted. Someone else dropped their champagne. Whispers rippled across the lawn like wind through reeds. He's been trained. He's no tortoise. There's something in the peas. You sit up on your bench, half a biscuit in your mouth, suddenly wide awake. This is history. By the next morning, the headlines in Le Petit Paresseux screamed, "Tortoise tamed her trickery afoot." The article accused Frederick's owner, Monsieur Jules Bellamy, a retired button merchant, of ainsier moniteur, falsifying the natural spirit of the race. Historians still argue whether the article was satire or if the paper genuinely believed Frederick had been somehow mechanized. One scathing paragraph suggested Bellamy had instructed the tortoise via aniseed trails and hypnotic whistling. The story gained traction. Cafe-goers debated it. Poets composed verses about it. "Faster than a fib," wrote one. He fled toward fame with lettuce in sight. Accusations flew. Was Frederick given stimulants? Was he actually a disguised hedgehog? One woman suggested his shell was made of papier-mâché, and he was hollow. An elderly man at the Café Le Canapé claimed he saw Bellamy talking to Frederick the night before, with a look of unnatural intensity. The final straw came during a follow-up race the next Sunday. A group of spectators arrived early, clutching magnifying glasses and opera glasses. They examined Frederick before the race. He looked like a tortoise, smelled like a tortoise, moved, well, less quickly than before. Bellamy, red-faced and oddly defensive, announced Frederick was feeling pressure from the media. The crowd snickered. When the race began, Frederick sat down and refused to budge. Some said he'd been shamed. Others said he was just being a tortoise again. Then, at the height of confusion, a journalist named Henri Lafosse burst onto the scene. Literally, he tripped over a stroller and announced that he had proofs of race tampering. Out of his satchel, he pulled a jar of lettuce water.
The theory? Bellamy had soaked a cloth in the solution and trailed it from start to finish, creating a scent path that Frederick followed with speed and single-mindedness. While ingenious, the idea caused the crowd to erupt into laughter, then polite applause. Bellamy stammered. "It was only an experiment," he said. "I love my tortoise." Someone shouted, "Maybe too much?" Bellamy and Frederick were politely escorted away. No formal charges were filed. The races continued. But the Great Tortoise Scandal of 1851 lived on. For weeks afterward, jokes about performance-enhanced lettuce spread across the city. Tortoise treats were sold labeled, "Now with 30% less scandal." Artists drew Frederick wearing a fake mustache. One clever child tied a celery stalk to a stick and dangled it before his tortoise, shouting, "I call this the Bellamy technique." Lafosse, enjoying his accidental fame, wrote a pamphlet titled Of Reptiles and Rascals, in which he theorized that tortoise racing mirrored the corruption of modern society. The pamphlet sold 17 copies. But the best part? Frederick was never banned. He quietly re-entered races months later, no blue ribbon, no fanfare, no lettuce trail. And he came in last, gloriously, sluggishly last. People clapped anyway. You watch now, as a race begins. A new tortoise, perhaps a distant cousin of Frederick, begins a very slow crawl forward. Someone whispers, "Watch closely. I think he's got mint on his shell." Another answers, "Good." Keeps the bees away. The scandal is gone, but the joy remains, because even in a moment of controversy, Parisians didn't abandon their absurd pastime. They just made it funnier, gentler, even more ridiculous. A man nearby opens a betting notebook, just sketches and smiley faces, and announces, "This race will be scandal-free unless Marcel eats the track again." Marcel, a notably round tortoise, blinks slowly and turns in a circle. Everyone cheers. You smile again, because you realize that even the biggest scandal in tortoise racing history couldn't change the heart of it. It was never really about fairness, or speed, or even the tortoises. It was about gathering, watching, laughing softly, and loving the silly little traditions that make life livable. And somewhere, probably under a shady rose bush, Frederick is still chewing a leaf, happily unaware of the legacy he left behind.
So, after the scandal subsides, the racing resumes, slower than ever, and with perhaps a little more dignity. But amidst the tea-soaked gossip and retellings of the Bellamy affair, a curious trend begins to ripple through the community. Tortoise training. Yes, you heard that right. In the very city that birthed the can-can and couture, people start whispering about it coaching tortoises. Quietly at first, like it's a secret society. But then, more boldly, flyers appear in the backs of cafes. Shell your potential. Reptilian performance workshops, 10 francs per session. The idea is laughable. Tortoises? Trained? But this is Paris. If people can train poodles to waltz, surely someone can teach a tortoise to follow a straight line, right? The answer, as you discover while nibbling a pear tart under a tree, is maybe, but very slowly. Enter Monsieur Anatole Mijon, self-proclaimed reptile motivator. A wiry man with wild eyebrows and a serious limp. He's often seen wearing a coat with far too many buttons and carrying a cane carved in the shape of a lizard. He claims to have studied animal behavior in lion and insists tortoises respond to vocal tonality, dietary finesse, and emotional synchronization. You attend one of his demonstrations out of sheer curiosity. The crowd is modest. A few students, some overly enthusiastic old ladies, and a man selling roasted almonds. Anatole steps up with dramatic flair and introduces his star pupil. Josephine la Troisième, a robust tortoise with a crimson silk sash and an expression of quiet disdain. He speaks gently to her, waves a marigold, clicks his tongue rhythmically, and after 2.5 minutes, she moves forward, 2 inches. The crowd gasps. Anatole bows. Someone faints, though that may be from the heat. Historians still argue whether Anatole was a fraud or a true believer. Some claimed he used hidden food scents or barely perceptible vibrations in the ground to direct movement. Others insisted his tortoises simply did what all tortoises do, eventually move, just with more dramatic lighting. Regardless, training fever takes hold. Suddenly, everyone's talking about conditioning, about reward systems, about the importance of consistent lettuce. One woman swears by reciting poetry to her tortoise at bedtime. Another trains hers to move to the sound of a triangle bell. A child teaches his to recognize the difference between sun and shade and rewards it with a grape every time it chooses correctly. You're not sure it's science, but it's adorable. The term tortoise whisperer is thrown around far too often. Soon, training clubs emerge. People gather weekly to practice drills. A popular setup involves small hurdles made of pencils. Another involves a maze of flower pots with parsley prizes at the center. Results are mixed. One tortoise escapes through a hole in a shoe and isn't seen again until autumn. Another simply refuses to engage and becomes a local legend known as Le Stoïque. Anatole, for his part, leans into his growing fame. He gives interviews. He writes a column in Reptile Illustré titled Minding Your Colonian. His theories get bolder. Tortoises understand time, he insists. They simply don't respect it. He offers private consultations. One wealthy widow pays handsomely to have her tortoise reconnected with its competitive instinct. When asked how it went, she replies, "It took 3 weeks, but he blinked." I'm optimistic. Naturally, the satire follows. Cafe artists sketch cartoons of tortoises in tiny sweatbands doing stretches. One musical duo writes a ballad called Too Fast for the Ferns, featuring the line, "He saw the lettuce, and he went eventually." Still, the idea doesn't entirely fade. There's something oddly satisfying in believing you can guide a tortoise's destiny. Not control it. No, that's far too modern. But nudge it. Encourage it. Suggest, gently, that if it wanted to win a small, informal race surrounded by humans sipping absinthe, well, it could. One memorable figure in this era is Theodore, a tortoise who reportedly responded to the scent of cinnamon. His owner, an apothecary's apprentice, claimed it stimulated his inner fire. Theodore's movements were erratic but passionate. He rarely won, but when he did, it was by accident and with great fanfare. Then there's Lisette, known for listening to piano. Her owner, a conservatory student, insisted Lisette would move faster during nocturne. A particularly rainy afternoon saw Lisette race 5 full meters across wet grass during a Chopin recital. Coincidence? Mystery? Marketing? Either way, the papers called her La Flèche de Fa majeur, the arrow of F major. You watch one of these newly trained tortoises now. It's wearing a small rosette. Its owner hums softly, tapping the shell like a metronome. The tortoise pauses, then slowly, steadily makes its way forward. The crowd claps. Someone throws confetti. It's mostly dried parsley. But the sentiment is real. Does training actually work? Does it matter? The ritual itself becomes half the joy. As you lean back again, you hear a man behind you say, "I've started reading Descartes to mine. I think he's contemplating free will." His friend replies, "Mine won't move unless I insult his ancestors." It's all nonsense. Beautiful, harmless, human nonsense. Because in a world constantly pushing for more, faster, louder, tortoise training is the gentle pushback. It's the slow, smiling reminder that maybe, just maybe, we're not in control. And that sometimes the best thing we can do is crouch in the grass, whisper sweet nothings to a creature in a bow tie, and wait for it to decide whether today is a moving day. Of course, not everyone in Paris was charmed by the sight of a tortoise in a waistcoat inching across the grass, while a group of adults clapped and wept like they were watching a royal coronation. Enter the intellectuals, the philosophical set, who, naturally, had opinions. You spot them as easily as a sun-drenched tortoise in a garden bed. A group of men in long coats and dramatic beards, women in high collars with furrowed brows, all seated a safe distance from the racing crowd, nursing coffee and disapproval. They sit in iron garden chairs beside a cafe table with a chessboard no one is actually playing. They are reading, always just slightly, louder than necessary. To them, tortoise racing is a cultural embarrassment, a symptom of decadence, a metaphor for the slow collapse of reason. You hear one declare, "This is what we've become?" A city of fools applauding vegetables on legs. Another snorts and murmurs something about the tyranny of leisure. Historians still argue whether these critiques were genuine or just part of the broader performative intellectual angst of the time. Paris was, after all, in the throes of political uncertainty, artistic upheaval, and philosophical reinvention. The cafe debates were real, heated, and often absurd in their own way. But the tortoise races? Those were just silly. Still, some thinkers tried to frame them seriously. A poet named Vidal Beauchamp published an essay titled "The Shell and the Self," arguing that the tortoise represented mankind's retreat from authenticity in a mechanized age. "We cover our vulnerabilities in metaphor," he wrote, "and applaud what refuses to act." It sold poorly. Others were more cutting. A professor at the Sorbonne described the races as an insult to motion itself. He once stood in front of a crowd and shouted, "This is what happens when a society stops believing in consequences." Just as a tortoise named Daisy made a heroic, unexpected dash toward a grape. The crowd applauded. He stormed off. Yet some intellectuals couldn't help but be drawn in. Quietly, secretly. You once saw a philosopher named Guy Rousselet, known for his long-winded lectures on Stoicism, sitting at the edge of a race, completely entranced by a tortoise named Plato. When asked later, he claimed he was observing patterns in reptilian mindfulness. A group of self-described, existential Tortoisians. Yes, really, emerged in one cafe, declaring that the races revealed the absurdity of striving. They made banners. Let the shell win. They brought tortoises with names like Camus and Nausea to the races. None of them moved, ever. See, they whispered. One famed art critic, Madame Morel, attended a race under protest, pen in hand, ready to condemn the event in an editorial titled A Garden of Fools. But halfway through, she found herself quietly rooting for a tortoise named Biscot, who had paused for an hour beside a ladybug. She's contemplating beauty, Morel murmured. That editorial never got published. The Churchard even chimed in once or twice. A parish bulletin gently warned against placing too much affection in shelled idols, though it was followed by a bake sale featuring tortoise-shaped cookies, so the message was mixed. You sip your drink and listen as one philosopher insists that the races are a grotesque parody of the Olympic ideal. His companion responds, "You say that, but you cried when Maurice crossed the finish line last week." He blushes. This tension between the absurdity of the activity and the deep desire to find meaning in everything is very Parisian. The city thrives on contradictions. And nowhere are they more obvious than here, where tortoise races become not just entertainment, but unintentional thought experiments. Are the tortoises a symbol of resistance, of meditation, of pointless devotion? Does it matter? A pamphlet appears on your lap, handed to you by a man in spectacles who introduces himself as Gerard, observer of quiet things. It reads, Why We Cheer, a philosophical inquiry into spectator reptilianism. The central thesis? To wait without purpose is to be fully alive. It's nonsense, or genius, or both. Welcome to Paris. Over time, the critics grow quieter, perhaps worn down by the sheer charm of it all. Perhaps defeated by the persistence of people who bring lawn chairs and lemon tarts and whisper encouragements to creatures who may or may not know they're being watched. One professor, once a vocal opponent, begins bringing his tortoise Sophie to the races. She is shy, always last. He wears a pin that reads, "Slowness is sovereignty." He never explains it. A satirical cartoon in a local newspaper depicts a group of philosophers forming a barricade to stop a tortoise race, only to fall asleep waiting for the tortoises to arrive. The caption, Revolution in slow motion. You sit quietly again, watching. Around you, the conversations soften. Someone quotes Pascal. Someone else plays a flute. A tortoise turns, slowly, toward the finish line. Perhaps the intellectuals were right. Perhaps this really is all a metaphor. For futility. For hope. For modern life moving too fast. But maybe, just maybe, it's also about choosing to care about something utterly, gloriously unimportant. And finding joy in that. Because isn't that the most philosophical act of all? You blink slowly beneath the shade of your favorite tree, the scent of lilac in the air, and the sound of someone slowly peeling an orange nearby. And as the next race is announced, a particularly lazy one, the starter whispers, your attention drifts not to the tortoises this time, but to the audience itself. Not just who's watching, but who's mingling. Because while tortoise racing may appear to be just a niche Parisian pastime, in practice, it turns out to be one of the most unexpectedly democratic social events of the mid-19th century. In a city increasingly divided by class and culture, these slow-footed spectacles somehow draw together a uniquely diverse crowd. On your left, a young courtesan. fans herself delicately, balancing a wide hat on one gloved hand, and a tortoise named Papillon on her lap. She whispers sweet encouragements to him in a tone you suspect she usually reserves for dukes. On your right, a Kier post office clerk, with ink-stained fingers and a slightly too tight collar, frantically scribbles bets into a small notebook, using code names like Speedy Number Nangam. Between them, a group of Berkshire school children, all holding bits of chalk and wagering buttons and gumdrops on their favorites. One argues passionately that tortoises from the south move better in the sun. Another insists that darker shells are luckier, though he offers no source. Behind you, you hear the unmistakable rustle of a nun's habit. As Sister Genevieve, yes, that Sister Genevieve, prepares her tortoise for a contemplative crawl she calls a journey of grace. The tortoise, named Clément, carries a tiny cross-shaped pin on his shell. He walks with the Lord, she explains. No one objects. What's fascinating and utterly charming is how this slow, silly sport becomes a great social blender. At the races, titles and jobs dissolve like sugar cubes in tea. You might find a chimney sweep cheering beside a countess, both shrieking softly as their chosen tortoises nose past a piece of lettuce. You might overhear a shoemaker explaining tortoise traction to a curious philosophy student who clearly thinks he's discovered a new metaphor for destiny. Historians still argue whether the races were deliberately inclusive or just stumbled into it. Paris was a city of clear social divisions, but the gardens, those public green lungs of the metropolis, offered an in-between space, a kind of soft neutral ground. And in that space, when everyone was staring down at a creature that moved only slightly faster than moss, nobody really had the upper hand. You notice the subtle signs of this unlikely camaraderie. A man in a merchant's apron offers wine to a woman in a fouille lace collar per corner without hesitation. A femme fatale seamstress holds a parasol over the shell of a neighbor's tortoise. A Kurt Dalioshka bookseller, who clearly thinks he's too good for all this, chuckles when his tortoise inexplicably backs into a daisy bush. No one's networking, no one's pitching. There's no competition beyond the race itself. And even that's soft, sweet, and forgotten by the time someone brings out plum pastries. There's something rare here, something tender. A shared absurdity. A space where everyone agrees, silently, that this is dumb, but wonderfully dumb. And in agreeing, they connect. The effect is even more pronounced during the weekly twilight races. An unofficial event held at dusk where spectators gather in smaller numbers, the air cooler, the shadows longer. In these moments, the lines blur even more. You see musicians, laundresses, army deserters, and hanging air printmakers lounging together, sipping cider and watching tortoises move exactly nowhere with solemn appreciation. One particularly drowsy evening, a creek widower and a mum florist fall in love after their tortoises collide mid-race and refuse to separate. It was fate, she says. They stopped moving, together. The story spreads. Some begin placing their tortoises side by side on purpose. A few weddings follow, and even among the regulars, you see connections forming. Rivalries give way to friendships. A pastry apprentice and a pharmacist form an informal tortoise training club. An actress and a carriage driver team up to design matching race day outfits for their pets. A young retired colonel teaches a group of bakery boys how to polish shells without scaring the tortoise. It's chaos. Soft, slow, harmonious chaos. By now, you can recognize faces in the crowd. There's the man with the green cravat, who always bets on tortoises named after vegetables. The twins who claim they're tortoise. Matilda is clairvoyant. The woman with the embroidered tote full of sugar cubes. Not for the tortoises, mind you, but as rewards for their owners. And amid it all, you see younger and older generations mingling, often more freely than they do in drawing rooms or salons. Children pull grandparents toward the track. Grandparents retell stories of that legendary sprint of 49 with misty eyes. Teenagers attempt to race two tortoises using spoons as batons. It doesn't work. They laugh anyway. You can't help but be struck by the genuine warmth in the air. This isn't a forced gathering. It's chosen. People come here not because they must, but because they want to. And they come back again and again for that same odd blend of predictability and surprise. One man turns to you now, middle-aged, a bit sunburned, smells like ink and oranges. I used to come here with my brother, he says. He bet everything on a tortoise named Napoleon. She never moved, not once. But he swore she was waiting for her moment. You nod. You understand. Because sometimes the best kind of company is the kind that's willing to sit beside you, watching something small, and not say anything for a long, long time. And that's what these tortoise races have become. A strange, slow, unpretentious kind of community. A quiet revolution. A shell-covered utopia. And all it takes to join is to care just enough about something that doesn't matter at all. It's just past noon, and the sun is painting the garden in golds and greens, warm but not yet wilting. A soft breeze stirs the fronds of a nearby fern. Somewhere, someone opens a bottle of fizzy elderflower cordial, and from the far side of the lawn, you hear something unexpected. The clink of cups, the scrape of a chair, and a familiar sign swaying in the wind, painted with elegant looping script. Café de la Tortue. Yes, that's right, a whole cafe, dedicated to tortoise racing. Now, it's worth noting that Café de la Tortue isn't what you might expect. There are no grand awnings or marble counters. It's not even a building, technically. It's a converted corner of the park near the gravel track, outfitted with a few well-loved bistro tables, a makeshift wooden counter, and a small chalkboard menu that changes depending on how bored the owner is. And the owner? That would be Madame Colette, who refers to herself as proprietress of patience. She's round, ruddy, and rarely speaks above a whisper. She wears large hats, carries a parasol, even in the shade, and greets each customer as if they've just finished a 3-year voyage. Her cafe doesn't serve coffee quickly, and that's the point. Everything here is done at tortoise pace. Today's menu, written in a slightly wobbly hand, reads, Infusion de camomille et menthe, served warm, eventually. Tartelette aux figues, qui attend toujours la bonne heure. Pain paresseux avec confiture surprise. Vin de midi, no questions, just seeps. You settle into one of the iron chairs that rocks gently on the uneven lawn. A man beside you is halfway through a plate of soft cheese and seems entirely unbothered that it took 40 minutes to arrive. That's the charm, he tells you, through a mouthful of brie. You can't rush magic. Historians still argue whether Café de la Tortue began as a real business or just a well-funded prank. The story goes that Madame Colette lost a hat in a tortoise-related scuffle in 1847, and, in a moment of inspiration, decided the world needed a place where slowness wasn't just tolerated, but glorified. The cafe serves not just food, but ambiance. A small music box plays faint waltzes from behind the counter. A chalkboard lists Tortoise of the Week, complete with stats no one understands, like distance napped and favorite leaf. Today's honoree is a tortoise named Alphonse, who didn't move at all, and we respect that. The walls, well, trees, are decorated with small paintings and sketches donated by regulars. Tortoises in carriages. Tortoises balancing baguettes. Tortoises reenacting scenes from classic literature. One favorite shows a tortoise in a beret sipping espresso beside a pigeon in a trench coat. Caption: Lenteur et suspense. Children are welcome. Dogs are not for moral reasons, Colette once said, just because they chase things with more energy than we support. There's a small area known as the Shell Lounge, where people recline on cushions and read aloud from books that feature tortoises, or, failing that, books that move slowly. A small bell chimes when someone orders something. Not to signal speed, of course, just to give everyone something pleasant to hear while they continue waiting. You glance down and realize a tortoise is currently resting under your table. No one seems surprised. There's even a basket of lettuce near the register labeled for guests, both human and otherwise. This cafe becomes a kind of headquarters. Not official. There's no registry or membership cards, but socially, spiritually, clearly. If something needs announcing, a change in race start time, a birth of tortoise hatchlings, the return of a long-lost favorite, it happens here. And every so often, someone stands up with a clink of spoon on glass and raises a toast to those who move at their own pace. It's always met with claps, slow ones. One table near the ficus is dubbed the philosopher's shell. Not because philosophers sit there necessarily, but because no one talks at all, and everyone just stares at the garden like it's teaching them something. Which perhaps it is. Madame Colette occasionally hosts shell salons in the evenings, readings of slow poems, meditations, or amateur theater where the actors must speak at the pace of a tortoise's step. One performance of Hamlet reportedly lasted 5.5 hours and was stopped midway when the lead actor fell asleep on stage. The audience clapped anyway. You sip your mint infusion. It is, as promised, served warm and eventually. You can't remember when it arrived. You don't need to. Near the counter, someone plays a slow game of dominoes with their tortoise. Every time it nudges a piece, they adjust the score accordingly. It's not clear who's winning. No one cares. The sky begins to tilt toward afternoon. Light slants over the garden in soft waves. The tortoises outside begin to reposition, slowly turning toward the sun like mossy sunflowers. Madame Colette emerges from the shade with a tray of tarts and announces, "They're finally ready." Someone claps. The clapping continues a little longer than it should. She bows. You realize that Café de la Tortue isn't just a place. It's an idea, a protest, a refuge, a declaration that slowness is not weakness, that stillness can be celebration, that tea tastes better if it takes 20 minutes to arrive, because by then, you've earned it. You stay seated long after your cup is empty. No one rushes you. The tortoise under your table blinks slowly. Or maybe not. Hard to tell. Either way, it feels like permission to stay still a while longer. The story begins to shift one afternoon in late summer, when a small handwritten sign appears beside the gravel race path, nestled between a poppy bush and a sleeping tortoise. The paper is curling at the edges, the ink slightly smudged, but the message is clear. Farewell exhibition. One last walk for Monsieur Lentille. The name alone causes a stir. You've heard of Monsieur Lentille, the gentle stroll, as he's often called. A legend not because he won races, but because he was so consistent in not winning. A tortoise who moved like syrup on a winter morning, who stopped halfway through most races to nap, regardless of cheers, bribes, or the occasional tambourine. And yet, everyone loved him. He was, by all accounts, a fixture of the scene, easily recognizable by the soft green tint of his shell and the small sunflower charm tied gently around his middle. Children used to leave him tiny notes. One woman claimed he only responded to Chopin. Another claimed he had a crush on Madame Pompon. The truth? He didn't seem to notice any of them, and maybe that's what made him so perfect. Now, apparently, he's retiring. You arrive early to the farewell walk, as do many others. The crowd is larger than usual, and quieter too. There are pastries, but they're not eaten right away. There's lemonade, but no one's spilling it in excitement. Even the gardeners are watching, leaning on their rakes. At precisely 2 o'clock, though everyone pretends they're not watching the clock, a young man in a dusty straw hat steps forward with a picnic basket and gently lifts Monsieur Lentille out. The tortoise blinks once, or maybe not. He's placed at the starting line, but there's no race today, just a path, a destination, and a slow goodbye. No one speaks. Someone plays a soft violin. A breeze picks up, as if cued, and then Lentille moves. Historians still argue whether this moment actually happened, as it's retold now in letters and legends. Some insist it was dramatized in the retelling. Others swear they were there. What everyone agrees on, though, is that Lentille walked, uncharacteristically directly, toward the far end of the track, where a small arch sign had been placed, reading, Merci, vieil ami. It takes him 42 minutes. Along the way, people place clover, rose petals, tiny notes, and crumbs of plum tart in his path, not to lure him, just to honor him. One child, barely old enough to pronounce tortoise, draws a heart in the dirt with her finger. A poet reads a line aloud. There goes the slowest dream I ever loved. And then, at the end of the walk, something truly odd happens. Lentille stops, lifts his head, and lets out a long, slow exhale. Audible, distinct. The crowd erupts in gentle applause. Someone wipes away a tear. The violin continues. The wind seems to pause. From that day forward, Lentille is said to have retired to a quiet garden estate on the city's edge, owned by a florist and a schoolteacher who both claim they knew him before he was famous. They report that he now spends his days eating fennel and ignoring everyone, which is entirely on brand. Occasionally, letters arrive in the cafe addressed to him. One reads, You inspired me to do less, and I thank you. Another, Whenever I slow down now, I think of your brave stillness. The third simply says, Do you miss us? We miss you. Every so often, rumors swirl that he might return for a special race, a surprise appearance, a ceremonial crawl. But he never does. The myth of Monsieur Lentille only grows. His image appears on handkerchiefs. A woodcut of his farewell stroll is sold at the Café de la Tortue. A painter creates an enormous portrait, titled The Patient Exit. It hangs in a local bakery for 3 months, until it's replaced by a picture of a baguette. But still, a small group of fans begins holding Lentille walks every spring. Slow, meandering strolls through the garden with no destination and no talking. Just walking, slowly, reverently. A man in his 80s tells a reporter, It's the only time I feel like I'm not running out of time. One particularly philosophical regular suggests that Lentille wasn't retiring, but ascending to a higher tier of stillness. Another nods solemnly and replies, "He's not gone. He's just exceptionally delayed." In a way, it's true. Lentille becomes more than a tortoise. He becomes a story, a symbol, a shared breath. His absence is a kind of presence. When people wait for their tea to steep, they say, "It's a Lentille brew." When someone is late to a picnic, they're told, "You move like the master." And then one day, many months later, a postcard arrives at the cafe. No return address, just a watercolor of a tortoise shell under a lemon tree. Scribbled across the bottom in curling script, "Still strolling, still grateful, still slow." You smile as you read it. Of course he would. And as another race begins on the far side of the lawn, as another new tortoise nudges her way toward a torn paper finish line, you can't help but think that Monsieur Lentille, wherever he is, would approve of it all. The people, the laughter, the leaves, the gentle insistence that slowness is not only acceptable, it's something worth celebrating. Because not all legends run. Some just keep walking, quietly, with dignity, toward nothing in particular. It was only a matter of time before the movement, the phenomenon, really, of tortoise racing began to stretch beyond the lawns and gardens. Because when Parisians love something, they don't just clap politely at a park event. They start selling things. And soon enough, the city saw a slow but unmistakable wave of tortoise-themed merchandise and satire rolling in. It began innocently, as many things in Paris do, with a single postcard. A charming watercolor of a tortoise peeking out from under a tiny parasol, with the words, "Vive la lenteur," "Long live slowness," looping across the bottom. The painter, unknown. The popularity, immediate. Soon after, shops in the Marais district began featuring small displays in their windows. Tortoise-shaped soaps, miniature silver brooches in the shape of tiny shells, and even pocket watches whose minute hand crawled at a deliberately lagging pace. For the leisurely minded, read one tagline. Children's toy shops jumped in too. You stroll past one now, watching as a boy presses a wind-up tortoise toy across a counter. It moves exactly 1 inch and stops. The boy is delighted. The label reads, "Guaranteed to arrive." Eventually. Historians still argue about the extent of this so-called tortoise economy. Some claim it was a full-blown retail craze. Others believe it remained more of a cottage industry, charming, modest, just successful enough to keep going without ever becoming ridiculous. But let's be honest, it became a little ridiculous. In the market near Rue Claire, a vendor sells racing greens. Lettuce leaves pressed between pages of old encyclopedias, sold as lucky charms for aspiring tortoise trainers. An entire stall offers shell polish in 6 shades, though all appear suspiciously identical. One woman claims her tortoise prefers the autumn mist finish. She winks. Newspapers get in on the fun too. Satirical cartoons show tortoises debating philosophy, hosting dinner parties, and forming unions to protest unfair race conditions. One memorable comic features a tortoise staring angrily at a sign reading, "Speed limit 2 centimeters per hour," and muttering, "Revolution." Poets and writers, never ones to let a trend pass without dipping a toe in, begin incorporating tortoises into their work. One writes an ode titled, "Ode to a Slumbering Champion," which includes the lines, "He moves not fast nor far, nor loud, yet gathers every cheering crowd. Meanwhile, bookshops advertise La philosophie de la tortue, an entirely fictional work supposedly authored by A. Colonian. It contains 37 pages of blank space, one sentence reading "think slower," and a footnote citing a nap. It sells out. The cafes aren't left behind either. At Café de la Tortue, new menu items appear: Pompon's patience pudding, Lentille's loaf, and a house cocktail called the Slow Spiral, which arrives in a corked bottle with instructions to wait for the fizz to settle before sipping. It never fizzes. Even fashion circles begin to turn their powdered noses toward the trend. One dressmaker in Montmartre designs a line of capes inspired by tortoise shells. Each is uniquely colored, textured, and designed to slow your walk for maximum elegance. A reviewer from Le Figaro snorts that the line is provocatively sluggish. You see one of those capes now, fluttering slowly behind a woman balancing a cup of cherry cordial and a tortoise in a wicker purse. She is glorious. She knows it. Even street musicians jump in. One trio sings a ballad titled Trottoir Tortue, about a tortoise in love with a bicycle. It is tender, tragic, and entirely untrue. They make a small fortune in coins, but it's not all about money. For many, the merchandise and satire serve a deeper purpose, a way to hold on to the joy, to carry a bit of that sunny lawn, that slow-motion cheer, into everyday life. A tortoise paperweight becomes a reminder not to hurry. A child's stuffed tortoise becomes a bedtime companion. A hand-painted pin serves as a conversation starter for two strangers who, 3 months later, find themselves naming a real tortoise together. Some of the products are utterly useless. A tortoise whistle, for example, which claims to summon your pet across a room. Tests reveal it only works if your tortoise was already headed that way. One woman claims hers dances. No one believes her, but they buy the whistle anyway. And then there's Reinfeld the satire. Gentle and affectionate, that becomes a love letter to the entire subculture. Parody races are held in back alley cafes, where humans crawl on all fours dressed as tortoises, competing to see who can get to a slice of pear tart the slowest. The winner is disqualified for moving with intention. A theater troupe performs Shellbound, a dramatic retelling of a tortoise's inner conflict over choosing whether to race or retire. The entire performance takes place in real time. 3 hours of monologues, sighs, and long pauses. It's reviewed as the boldest test of audience patience in modern memory. But somehow, all of this, every hat, every cookie cutter, every footnote about a sleepy tortoise, it never feels cynical. It feels like reverence. Mirthful, yes, but warm, respectful, like the city knows it's being silly and simply doesn't care. Or rather, it does care, but in the gentlest, most unhurried way possible. As you stroll past a flower vendor, you notice a stack of small paper bookmarks tied with twine. Each one bears a tiny tortoise illustration and the quote, "Slowness is not stillness. It's direction, disguised." You take one. Because as ridiculous as it all may seem, Paris has found a kind of wisdom in its tortoises, and now it wears that wisdom proudly on lapels and tea tins and tiny scarves, one slow inch at a time. Just when it all seemed harmless, charming, gentle, full of ribbon shells and drowsy applause, there came a brief moment in the story of Parisian tortoise racing when everything was on the almost fell apart. Yes, the calm was disturbed. The parsley-scented peace threatened. And not by a rogue tortoise uprising or a lettuce shortage, but by something far more formidable. Bureaucracy. It began with a memo. Not a dramatic one. Just a folded piece of parchment, tacked discreetly to the notice board near the entrance to the Jardin du Luxembourg, penned in a very serious hand. It read, Public Ordinance 47C, Temporary Moratorium on Non-Standard Animal Assembly Events in Government Gardens. It took a few days for anyone to realize this included tortoise races. No one panicked, not at first. After all, surely this was just a misunderstanding, a misplaced clause, a little paper hiccup in the great machine of Parisian governance. But then the race on Thursday was quietly canceled. No announcement, just an empty track, a few puzzled spectators, and a conspicuous lack of tortoises. The gardeners said nothing. The cafe said nothing. But the absence was louder than a marching band. Historians still argue. What exactly caused the ban? Some suspect it was fallout from the great tortoise scandal involving Frederick and the lettuce-scented trail. Others blame rising complaints about crowd size, crushed grass, and children falling into hedgerows while chasing their over-decorated pets. A few even whisper about a certain duke's wife who tripped over a tortoise named Marcel and took it very personally. Whatever the truth, for a stretch of 2 full weeks, the races were banned. And Paris got twitchy. People wandered the gardens aimlessly, clutching tortoises with no direction, no goal. A man was seen staring at the empty racetrack while softly singing, Allez, Béatrice, to no one. At Café de la Tortue, Madame Colette put up a sign that read, Closed due to existential malaise. Someone left a basket of spinach at the gate as an offering. It wilted. Newspapers took up the story. Le Quotidien ran a stern column titled, The Race to Nowhere. Should public space be slowed down? While Le Rêveur Parisien countered with, Let the little ones trot. A small protest broke out outside City Hall. Placards read, Let us crawl, and 1 inch at a time, 1 heart at a time. The public was polite, of course. It's hard to organize an aggressive rally around tortoises, but they were persistent. Children drew protest posters featuring tortoises behind bars. Poets recited odes outside Parliament. One particularly dramatic youth chained himself, gently, to a statue while holding a turtle plush. He fell asleep after 20 minutes. Still, the message was clear. Finally, the city responded. A meeting was held, and it was here, in the golden chamber of the Municipal Committee for Garden Decorum, that one Madame Lefebvre, secretary, tortoise owner, and woman of great persuasion, gave a speech that would go down in local legend. She stood up, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and read aloud, When we gather, we slow. When we slow, we see. And when we see, we smile. The tortoises have given us this. We ask only to give them space in return. Silence followed. One official reportedly dabbed his eye with a handkerchief. Another murmured, I had a tortoise once. His name was Gustave. He loved strawberries. The ordinance was amended by the end of the day. Tortoise racing was legal again. The return was triumphant. That Sunday, the crowd quadrupled in size. Bunting was strung between trees. Musicians played a waltz named The Return of the Shell. Children wore green ribbons. A tortoise named Justice was the honorary first to race, not particularly quickly, but with great emotional weight. Even the cafe unveiled a new item, Amnesty Tart, filled with apple and almond and served with a tiny flag that read, We wait for what we love. The gardeners grumbled but relented. One muttered, At least now they're doing it by the book. He was later spotted sneaking a biscuit to Camille under a hedge. Since that incident, every spring, the anniversary of the ban's repeal is marked with the Grand Procession of the Slow, where tortoises are paraded, yes, paraded down a small stretch of gravel while spectators toss clover petals and hum softly. It's not a race. It's a ceremony. The ordinance itself, still on the books, but now with a handwritten postscript slipped in by an anonymous clerk. Exceptions granted for creatures of shell dignity, moving with purpose at their own pace. You smile, reading it from the framed copy that hangs inside Café de la Tortue, just beside the pastry case. Because this wasn't just about bureaucracy or tradition. It was about fighting, gently, slowly, and with great decorum, for the right to gather, to laugh, to root for something impossibly slow, and, more importantly, to remember that sometimes the world is kinder when it lets a tortoise be a tortoise. While the Parisians were busily adjusting hats on tortoises and reciting poetry at the pace of a gentle breeze, the rest of the world began to take notice. Whispers crept across the channel. Letters arrived at cafes signed with distinctly English flourishes. And before long, the phenomenon that had been brushed off as just another French oddity began appearing in a few very prim and proper travel diaries. Which brings us to a delightful chapter in our story. How the British reacted to all this. It started, appropriately enough, with a letter published in the London Review of Civilized Affairs, a paper that could make tea feel inadequate. A certain Sir Horace Wimbrel recounted his recent trip to Paris. He had hoped for lectures, perhaps a salon or two, but what he found instead, he wrote, was a field full of Parisians worshipping what can only be described as a decorative footstool with legs. The footstool, of course, was a tortoise named Fleur, wearing a tiny cape with embroidered gold tassels. Sir Horace was horrified, or fascinated, or both. Historians still argue whether this report was satirical or sincere, but its publication opened the floodgates. Soon, other English visitors began investigating. A particularly curious Baroness Maud Hillingdon included a sketch of a tortoise race in her Paris travel memoirs. The caption read, "They move only slightly faster than British Parliament, but with greater decorum." A few British newspapers took up the tale, unsure whether to mock or marvel. The Illustrated London Crier published an engraving of a race titled "The French at Leisure, a Study in Continental Absurdity." It shows 3 tortoises approaching a cabbage leaf, watched by a man weeping into a lace handkerchief. The subtitle, "No Urgency Detected," and yet not all mockery was equal. Some visitors were enchanted. A certain Professor Erasmus Quimbley, a naturalist with a fondness for bees and slow phenomena, declared the races the most meditative public event in Western Europe. He compared them to tea rituals and overlong symphonies. He even attempted to bring the tradition to Oxford. The effort flopped, but only because it rained for 3 straight weeks and the tortoises never made it out of their crates. Back in Paris, the locals welcomed the foreign attention. Café de la Tortue added the English option to its menu. Black tea with milk served precisely 12 minutes after ordering, accompanied by a scone shaped like a tortoise. It was dry. Perfectly so. Tourists began trickling in. First curious, then committed. A gentleman from Bath, named Reginald Thistlewick, attended 7 races in 8 days, each time wearing a different waistcoat. When asked what brought him back, he simply said, there is a majesty to hesitation. One English governess, visiting with her employers, was overheard saying, "They make eye contact. I swear they do. The small one with the ribbon knows my thoughts." She later wrote an article titled, "On the Subtle Agency of French Reptiles." Of course, not all reactions were glowing. A Scottish clergyman declared the practice a betrayal of Protestant work ethic and insisted that encouraging slowness was a dangerous moral slide. His letter was posted in the Parisian cafe window, next to a chalkboard that read, "Dangerous moral slides served warm with fig compote." It's worth noting that a few particularly enthusiastic British visitors did attempt to bring racing tortoises back across the channel. One gentleman smuggled 3 in his suitcase, only to discover they had no interest in racing on his damp Surrey lawn. "They're homesick," he sighed, "or shy." He opened a tea shop instead. A small bookshop in Bristol published a pocket guide called "How to Host Your Own Tortoise Derby, with or without Parisians." It included instructions on shell etiquette, ribbon selection, and a warning never to race near garden gnomes. "They don't like being watched," the guide insisted. Back in Paris, a rumor floated through the garden that Queen Victoria herself had been informed of the trend. No evidence supported this. Still, a small plaque was added near the racetrack, "By royal indifference." Even within Britain, opinion was split. Some saw it as peak French frivolity, others a balm to modern anxieties. One English visitor, after watching Camille nudge her way toward a blackberry for 45 minutes, was overheard saying, "It's quite like cricket. You don't watch for action. You watch because you can." And perhaps that was the real connection. Two cultures so often cast as opposites, Parisian flair and British restraint, found common ground in the slow crawl of a small shelled creature trying, vaguely, to reach a vegetable. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, of a British ambassador who attended a race while undercover. He reportedly wept into his cravat as Madame Pompon paused beside a daffodil and didn't move for 20 full minutes. When asked later what moved him, he whispered, "She understood time better than any of us." And so, despite the headlines and the caricatures, many Britons went home changed, quieter, slower. Some took up gardening. One woman returned and began placing small lettuce leaves along her windowsill, just in case. The tortoise races of Paris may have begun as a local eccentricity, but they reached across borders with the soft power of charm. Not loud, not insistent, just a slow wave of smiles, odd souvenirs, and strange new rituals. You lean back now, watching as a new race begins. A man beside you says, "I'm from Manchester. I came for the wine, stayed for the reptiles." He claps slowly as a tortoise named Edgar begins to turn in a gentle arc toward the shade. You nod, because you know. Everyone knows. No matter where you come from, sometimes you just need to cheer for something slow. As with all lovely things, even the tortoise races, gentle, ribbon-draped, parsley-scented and adored, couldn't escape the slow tug of time. And just as tortoises eventually pause, so too did the fashion for racing them. Tonight, we settle into the soft hush of change as we follow César, the gentle decline of the tortoise craze. There's no dramatic end, no abrupt decree, no scandal, Frederick's lettuce-scented legacy having long since faded into folklore. Just a quiet tapering, like the last note of a lullaby played far from its piano. One day the crowd is full, and the next, just pleasantly scattered. At first, you barely notice it. The cushions on the benches are a bit more worn. The The Café de la Tortue doesn't restock the shell-shaped scones as often. Madame Colette has started closing earlier, for the light, she says, though no one really questions her. The violinist, who used to play softly by the starting line, now performs only on Sundays. It's not that the races stop, it's that the city changes around them. Historians still argue about why the passion faded. Some blame the rise of more modern amusements, balloon shows, panoramic exhibits, the electrifying hum of a city inching toward the future. Others point to simple exhaustion. After 2 decades of slow, sweet racing, maybe people just needed something different. There are other theories. One insists that a particularly rainy spring in 1859 washed out several key race days, and the momentum never quite returned. Another points to the rise of chess cafes, which, believe it or not, somehow managed to feel faster than watching tortoises race. The regulars begin to age. The children who once named their tortoises after emperors and desserts grow up, drift away, take up fencing, or oil painting, or courtship. Some bring their own children back, of course, but the sparkle has changed. The ribbons feel more like homage now, less like style. You sit on your usual bench. It's still here, still a bit crooked. But you notice more gaps in the audience. The same tortoises arrive, but there are fewer cheers, fewer poems scribbled on folded paper and left beside race lines. Camille, still limping a little, appears only once a month now. Madame Pompon's fan club has been reduced to a single elderly woman in lavender gloves who brings her violets and speaks to her in rhymes. Beauregard, the old noble, hasn't raced in years. A framed portrait of him hangs in the cafe window, shell shining under a painted beam of light. The races go on, but they become slower. And not just because of the tortoises. One day, someone asks Madame Colette if there will be a race that week, and she simply smiles and replies, "If they feel like it." She pours tea. It takes 12 minutes. There are still moments of magic, of course. A new tortoise, young, unbothered, named Pistache, wins 3 straight races one spring and briefly revives interest. A paper prints a headline, "Hope in a Half Shell." But the story is bumped from the front page by news of a mechanical dancing horse. Still, for those who remain, the ritual is enough. A baker arrives every Saturday with a picnic basket, even if no one races. He unpacks it carefully. He nods to the tortoises, whether they're moving or not. He reads the newspaper aloud to them, very slowly. One tortoise, Maurice, seems particularly interested in the sports section. A school teacher brings her class once a year to learn about quiet. She asks them to sit silently and watch a tortoise of their choosing for 10 minutes. One child writes afterward, "He didn't go far, but I liked where he was." That's the thing. Even in decline, the races never lose their tenderness. They become less of a fad and more of a fable. Something you whisper about in cafes and remember in detail you didn't realize you'd saved. A new law quietly permits the planting of tortoise greens along the western edge of the garden, just in case. A statue is commissioned, a bronze tortoise named Clementine. Positioned mid-stride near the original racetrack, the plaque reads, "For all who arrived, even if they took their time." You run your fingers over the shell one afternoon. It's cool. Still, peaceful. In the evenings, as the shadows grow long and soft, music drifts from an open window. You sometimes hear the low murmur of those who still gather. They don't call it racing anymore. They just call it watching. And sometimes, even visiting. The races may no longer stop traffic, but they still stop time. And that, in a city like Paris, is no small magic. You stay a little longer on your bench. A tortoise you don't recognize, young, tentative, curious, emerges from behind a rose bush. He sees you. You see him. No one moves. Eventually he takes a step. You don't clap. You don't cheer. You simply smile. Because you understand now. Some things don't need to last forever to leave a mark. Some things go quiet not because they were forgotten, but because they've gone deep. Beneath the rush, the clamor, the hurried pages of history, waiting, just like a tortoise. Of course, where there are legends, there are myths. And in the soft, sleepy corners of Paris where tortoise races once reigned, there remains one story whispered more than most. A tale so gently absurd, so poetically ridiculous, that no one dares ask if it's true, because in a way that matters, it already is. This is the story of Monsieur Lentille, and the legend of his faked death. Yes, faked. According to certain cafe regulars, and at least one ex-gardener with a fondness for conspiracy, the celebrated Lentille, the same who took the grand farewell walk, who now appears in handkerchief designs and garden murals, never really retired. You lean in now, curious, because this isn't a tale told with dramatic flair or shouted by eccentrics on park benches. It's murmured between sips of tea, late in the afternoon, when the sunlight is golden and people have the time to say, well, there is a version of the story you haven't heard. According to this version, Lentille's final walk was a performance, a deliberate exit staged to create the perfect ending. A tortoise swan song. The signs were all there, they say. The suspiciously symmetrical arch at the finish line. The elaborate floral crown he just happened to receive. The way he paused, raised his head, did he wink? And exhaled like a retiring actor. Historians still argue whether Lentille's walk was spontaneous or choreographed. The official record claims he retired to a flower garden and lived out his days under fig leaves. But then came the sightings. Not at first, but slowly, like all things tortoise-related. A baker in Montmartre swore he saw Lentille under a cafe table. No ribbon, no fanfare, just munching on a grape. A child at the Luxembourg Gardens reported a tortoise with a suspiciously familiar shell pattern walking very deliberately past the finish line at dawn. No one else saw him, she said, but I know it was him. He nodded at me. The rumors grew. A postcard arrived at Café de la Tortue, unsigned, with a drawing of a tortoise beside a sun hat, reading a newspaper titled, Still Here. A poetry journal printed a limerick about a shelled Parisian trickster who left his shell, but not the scene. And then there's the gardener, old, weathered, mostly retired, who insists that Lentille was spotted near the city's edge during a rainstorm. He was walking backward, slow and proud, the gardener claims, like a king who knows he's no longer watched but refuses to speed up. The cafe now serves a drink called the backwards Lentille, lukewarm cider poured over a single ice cube that takes 20 minutes to melt. But why fake a tortoise death? Here's the theory. Lentille, tired of fame, craved slowness again. Not the performative slowness of public races, but the real kind. The kind no one watches. The kind that belongs to dappled light and hidden clover patches. So he staged his exit. And now, they say, he wanders freely. Some believe he's creating a secret tortoise society. Others think he simply lives under a shaded bench somewhere, occasionally listening to the whispers of those who still remember. One man swears he heard tapping on the underside of his park bench, like shell on stone. He looked. Nothing. But he left half a cherry just in case. Whether or not the legend is true doesn't seem to matter. People want it to be. It gives them something to look for, someone to miss. A tortoise ghost story without the ghost? Just a very slow mystery that never quite resolves. In spring, some still leave tiny tributes where Lentille once took his walk. Notes that read, "We still wait for you," and "Tell Pompon hello," and "Hope you're napping somewhere wonderful." And once a year, on the anniversary of his retirement, someone, no one knows who, leaves a single white clover at the start of the old track. Fresh, never wilted. A gardener claims it's a different hand each time. A librarian believes it's Madame Colette herself. A child insists it's Lentille, who sneaks out at night wearing tiny boots. You sit now at your bench and imagine it. A shell in the shadows, still moving, still choosing his own pace. He doesn't need applause. He doesn't need ribbons. He just needs distance. And fig leaves. Because maybe Lentille didn't leave us. Maybe he just returned to the one thing he always did best, going wherever he pleased, whenever he wanted, and never once checking if we were watching. And we still are. Even now, long after the ribbons have faded and the crowds have thinned, traces of the tortoise era remain scattered throughout the fabric of Paris. Quiet, stubborn remnants that refuse to hurry away. If you know where to look, the legacy lives on. Start in the Jardin de Luxembourg, where it all began. Walk along the sunlit gravel paths just after dawn, when the park is nearly empty except for joggers and pigeons. Near the southeast fountain, past the third bench on the left, the one with the crooked iron leg, you'll find a small, unmarked patch of earth where the grass always grows a little slower. Locals call it le départ fantôme, the phantom starting line. There's no sign, no plaque, but someone, every few weeks, lines up 4 stones in a shallow arc, a silent homage. Occasionally, a clover leaf is placed at the end. The wind sometimes takes it away, but not always. Wander over to the cafe, and you'll notice the chalkboard menu. Still features Tortue du jour. It doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just tea and toast. But regulars still smile when they order it. The cafe's pastry counter sells galettes, lentes, slow cakes, made with oats, apples, and a mysterious herb for patience. Children stare through the glass case at the miniature tortoise pastries with sugar shell tops. Historians still argue whether these things count as true remnants or just a kind of cozy myth-making. But for the people who notice them, that distinction hardly matters. On Rue Mazarine, an antique shop sells tiny silver charms shaped like tortoises. The shopkeeper claims they were cast from the mold of a medal given to Madame Pompon in 1853. He won't say how he got the mold. He winks and adjusts his monocle. Further down the block, in a narrow window above a bookstore, hangs a faded poster. Go, Maurice, go. The letters are crooked, the paper browned with age. The owner says it came with the shop. She leaves it there because someone always smiles when they see it. There's a Chasse street artist who occasionally chalks tortoises on the sidewalks, not cartoonish ones, but detailed, meditative creatures mid-step, often with tiny hats or poetic quotes beneath them. One reads, "We arrive when we mean to, and we mean to." The races are gone. Yes, but the city remembers. You pass an old woman knitting under a maple tree. She hums softly. You glance down. Her yarn bag is shaped like a tortoise. Coincidence? Maybe. But as she finishes the row, you swear you hear her whisper, "Just like Lentille used to turn." Schoolchildren are still told the story of the tortoise who beat time. One teacher reads a poem each spring, ending with the line, "The fastest thing you'll ever love is something that waits." A boy in the back nods solemnly. His drawing later features a tortoise wearing a monocle, sipping tea and quoting Proust. In the corner of the garden library, a single book, its spine crooked, its pages frayed, rests under a sign, "Do not rush." The title? Tortoise Tales, A City's Slowest Romance. No author, no publisher. Inside, stories, sketches, a recipe for almond biscuits, and a fold-out map marking significant shell sites. You take a copy. The librarian smiles. "It always returns," she says, "even if it takes years." And then, of course, there's the statue. Cast in bronze, no taller than your knee, nestled in the corner near the poplar trees. The tortoise, clearly modeled after Camille, based on the familiar shell scar, is depicted mid-stride, head slightly tilted. On the base is carved, "To all who moved, even if only a little." It's not fenced. It's not lit. Children climb on it. Gardeners sometimes polish it, sometimes don't. But always, always, someone leaves something nearby. A cherry, a ribbon, a handwritten note. "Thanks for teaching me stillness." And perhaps the sweetest legacy lies in the way people now sit in the park. Longer, quieter. You watch them, Parisians, tourists, dreamers, leaning back with their coffee, not checking the time, just watching the light shift through the leaves, listening, breathing. A young woman reads aloud to her daughter. The book features a tortoise and a crown. The girl asks, "Did she win the race?" The mother pauses, then answers, "She did." But only because she didn't care about winning. And nearby, under a bench, a real tortoise, maybe wild, maybe not, emerges, takes one look at the world, and retreats slowly back into the shade. The races may be over, but their echoes, they're everywhere. Not loud, not flashy, but enduring. Paris, it turns out, still loves what moves slowly. You've been here for a while now. Maybe you didn't even notice how long. That's the effect this story has. It doesn't ask you to pay attention. It doesn't insist. It simply waits for you to settle into its rhythm. The rhythm of a city that once, for no practical reason at all, decided that the best way to pass the time was to cheer for tortoises. And maybe now, as you sit once again on that creaky wooden bench, you understand something deeper. Something that everyone who ever returned to the races must have sensed too. This wasn't just about animals with shells. It was about us. About what it means to pause, to be silly, to share space with strangers and find something unexpectedly lovely in the act of waiting. Because really, who were the people who gathered each week to lay down bits of lettuce and place tiny ribbons on indifferent reptiles? They were workers, poets, children, widows, philosophers, lovers, skeptics, dreamers, shoemakers, and singers. Some came for the races, some came for the calm, but all of them stayed for the same reason. There was nowhere else they had to be. And so they came. Some brought tortoises, others just brought time. Historians still argue whether the tortoise races had any true cultural impact, whether they influenced literature or fashion or the soul of the city. But the truth is that not everything needs to change the world to be worth remembering. Sometimes, it's enough that it made people smile, that it gave them a reason to sit beside one another, shoulder to shoulder, and care gently, humorously, wholeheartedly, about something that didn't matter. You think now about Madame Pompon, about Monsieur Lentille, about Frederick and his scandalous speed. You remember Camille's limp, and the child who named their tortoise Napoleon, 3.5. You remember the violins, the hats, the parasols, the strawberry lemonade, the chalk signs, the slow claps, the slower steps. You remember how, on one particularly perfect spring afternoon, no tortoise moved for an entire hour, and no one complained. They just stayed. And that's the lesson, isn't it? That sometimes, when everything around us is insisting we hurry, when the world is pushing forward faster than we can breathe, the most rebellious act is to go slowly on purpose, to stop, to sit, to wait. Not for anything in particular, just to wait. Because slowness teaches you to notice, to feel the breeze as it tiptoes through your collar, to hear the sparrow adjusting her weight on the railing, to smile as a leaf falls, lands upside down, and decides to stay that way. The tortoises never taught Paris anything about racing, but they taught it everything about presence. And now, long after the last ribbon was tied, and the final applause faded into summer air, you realize the truth that's been quietly waiting beneath this entire story. There are no small traditions, only quiet ones. The kind that burrow into a city's soil like clover roots and refuse to be rushed. So next time you see something small, something slow, something that doesn't seem to matter at all, maybe pause, look closer, cheer a little. And remember, the tortoise might not need your encouragement, but maybe you do. Now, as your eyes begin to grow heavy and your breath falls into its own soft rhythm, let the garden fade around you. The benches are emptying, the sun has dipped just below the horizon, and the last clink of a teacup has echoed away into the lavender dusk. The tortoises are still, curled in cozy corners, shells warmed by the memory of applause and 1,000 whispered names. You've been walking slowly through this story, not rushing, not skipping ahead, just like they did, step by step, word by word. And maybe now, your body is ready to rest, your thoughts softening like footprints in a path of sand. Let your muscles relax. Let the rhythm of slowness wash over you like a lullaby no one had to sing aloud. There is nothing left to do. No race to win. You've arrived exactly where you were meant to be. Nowhere in particular, and just in time. Let the garden dissolve into stillness. Let your thoughts fall quiet like petals. Let your breath drift in and out with the patience of a tortoise who's found the perfect patch of sun. You are safe, you are slow, and you are exactly where you need to be. End of script. Sweet dreams.